Dominic, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. And we're celebrating 20 years of Property Rights Australia being in existence. So before we get started on some of the questions I've got here, can I get you to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
I'm Dominic Devine, for those of you who I haven't met throughout the last 30 years. And I had the privilege of being the inaugural chairman of PRA back in the early 90s. And it's a fantastic achievement to both the current board and the boards that have come over that 20 years that you guys are here today celebrating 20 years of the organisation. I certainly didn't foresee that that what started off as a meeting under the trees on the front lawn at Torres Park in December of 1991 would be the birth of an organisation that would have a 20-year history and still going strong.
What were the circumstances in 2002-3 that led to the realization from you and others that something had to be done?
The basis of PRA started from a very small fundamental problem, and it centered around Ashley McKay. And Ashley had been, as we all know, a stalwart of the industry, had been an advocate and leader, both back in the days of the Cattlemen's Union and after that, in standing up for the grazing industries, and being brave. And unfortunately, he drew the attention of government, and Ashley got charged with a tree clearing offence back in 01, and it was an offence around basically clearing outside permit boundaries, the tree clearing permits that he was issued, and it was fundamentally unjust and went beyond unfair. We were eventually able to prove that it was what the Crown were doing was illegal. And the fundamentals of the case come down to a change in governance by the government of the day, which was the Beattie Labor government, and an increased focus on compliance. Tree clearing permits, for those who are probably not aware, I started my career off in the Queensland Department of Lands, actually issuing tree clearing permits. And permits in those days, if you go back in history, they were called permits to destroy trees. So, which our environmental friends now would just roll their eyes at. But the whole premise of the development of farming and pastoral lands in Queensland was development. And in fact, the role of the Lands Department back in the day was to actually facilitate that development. So land was cut up, and it was about 85% of land, or I think it was 87% of land in Queensland was leasehold, which means it come under the control of the Crown. And the role of the Department of Lands in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right through to the end of the 90s was to actually facilitate the ongoing development of that. And the permitting system, it evolved continually, and particularly during the 90s, where a lot more emphasis was placed on landowners around preserving protected areas, so vegetation along water courses, not clearing on slopes that were too steep, leaving adequate retention of virgin vegetation for, in those days, the focus was actually on livestock shade more than anything. And the permitting system and the conditions around it were very non-prescriptive. It was more a set of guidelines that you left the landowner who had the experience to actually implement on the ground as they did their clearing and their development. So the mapping that was issued with that was really very basic. They were hand-drawn sketches. Permit areas were marked out with highlighters, and the landowner was given a set of conditions that were very guideline based. And that's what Ashley's permit looked like. This also, the late 90s saw the onset of satellite imagery came into play. And so when we saw a change of government, we saw a change of focus by the Labor government at the time to really focus on reducing land clearing in Queensland and eventually eliminating it, which they did do. And what they did was they retrospectively applied technology, being the satellite imagery type mapping, on permits that are issued based on hand-drawn sketches. And that's where Ashley McKay found himself. So it became quite obvious to myself, a lot of Ashley's mates, neighbours, friends, that he was being singled out by government because he was outspoken. He was being singled out because he stood up. And the good thing about people in the bush, that they don't take that lightly. So we felt as a group of friends, I didn't, to be honest with you, I didn't own any land at the stage. I had family on the land. I was actually a young consultant in Charleville. I'd left the government by this stage. And I was 30 years of age. And I got together a group of his neighbours, people from the region, and we had a meeting up at Torres Park in December of 01. And the whole focus of that meeting was to actually get some money together, a fighting fund, as we called it, to financially assist Ashley to fight the charges. Because what I knew as coming out of that government system and as being in consulting at that stage for about, I went into business when I was 24, so I've been in for about 6 years and working in this space in the private sector, that I knew that if they were successful in prosecuting Ashley, there was literally hundreds and hundreds of landowners who were going to face the same prosecutions throughout Queensland. So, and those who knew Ashley and Dot know that he was a man of amazing integrity, and as I said before, brave. And he drew a line in the sand and just said no. So we got together and, yes, as I said, started out, 15 or 20 people sitting on the lawn at Torres Park in the shade of the house, beside the former fighting fund. And that's really where it started. And in late 01 into early 02, that was our prime focus, was actually raising money to help fight that case, because we knew it'd be a long road, because we knew if Ashley was successful, that the government would appeal, and that's what happened. The McKay case went on for quite a number of years. From memory, we were successful in the magistrates' court in the first instance. We then went to appeal and lost on appeal. We were then back in the magistrates' court, successful a second time, and eventually ended up being dealt with by the Court of Appeal in Queensland, and ultimately actually won, which was a major precedent for the industry. How did it? So the realization of something had to happen was the realization that, but it was very much focused on standing up for someone who, as a group, as a group of people, and it wasn't a big group. I look back and I reflected, Eric, when you asked me, who sent me these questions. I remember, Doug Cameron, Damien Donahue, a lot of these, my father-in-law, Don Bauer. Well, these guys are no longer with us. They've all since died. Sid Rodman, Sid's still alive, happily. Dave McKenzie, Robbie Grummett, Michael Flynn, Jack Summerfield. You're talking a dozen people, and just a dozen people that basically said enough was enough. Where it really gained, so we elected, and Ashley was always a person of process, very detailed man. We elected a committee at that stage, and I was asked to chair it, and it was very, very informal. In early given the nature you're dealing with money, we knew we would have to have some sort of legal structure. So in the early new year of 2002, that was PRA was formed as a lawful entity, and a constitution was drafted. A board was then put in place, so that committee became a board. There were some changes to it. Our initial board was myself as chair, Michael Flynn from Augathella, Noel Mobbs from Charleville, Noel, massive amount of experience in the industry, and Des Cuff. Des was a stock and station agent, which was probably the first time we'd seen a grazing-based organisation being chaired by a non-grazier and have a non-grazier on the board. So it was really a recognition for the first time that these type of issues, and we were focusing purely on property rights, that affected just not the owners of land, farmers, graziers, it affected the businesses that work with them. And I think that was one of the major step forwards in strategically. But where it gained the momentum was, look, I'll never forget this. I was at the Charleville show, and someone came up to me. We're starting to gain membership around Ashley's case, focusing really purely on that, because at that stage, other than this increase of compliance by the government, we had restrictions on leasehold tree clearing guidelines, quite strict at the time. But clearing of freehold land was still unrestricted. And although Ashley and I used to over a few beers, quite in the few years leading up to this, talk about the day that the government would put pressure on freehold clearing. I don't think we ever believed it'd actually come. And I was walking around the Charleville show, and Doug Cameron pulled me up. He said, "Have you heard the news?" He said, "No." He said, "Peter Beattie has just announced a total moratorium and ban on clearing on freehold land in Queensland." And it took me less than probably 10 minutes to hit the realisation that PRA was going to be something that was small, focused, easy to manage, to something that was going to be very big. And I started to think, I was 31, am I in depth here? And probably in hindsight, I probably was, frankly. But I had a lot of help, and our membership grew from, I think at that stage we would have had less than 50 people to 1,500 people, and it grew really quickly. It grew in a matter of months. We moved quickly to put on some permanent staff. So we employed a gentleman named Brad Henderson, and Brad came he was a political advisor to the previous National Party government. So Brad was the board were all volunteers, including myself. PRA was run out of my office in Charleville at no cost. We got a little bit of admin help and part-time, and we put Brad on as our first only full-time employee, and Brad was in charge of basically communications, media, and policy development, which was the smartest thing we did, because we had someone there every day focusing on the organisation and basically holding me to account and keeping me extremely busy. It had to be honest, PRA, that 3 years I was chairman had a pretty negative effect on our business at the time, but because it took me away from running a small business for massive amounts of time. But I don't regret one day of it, because it taught me a lot. And so we focused on being relevant. We focused on the whole focus of the organisation was about our arguments need to be based on good science. And this comes from the leadership of Ashley, to be honest. Ashley was always about the detail. So that if we were going to have a debate with government on this issue of banning tree clearing, that it had to be based on facts. So the whole thing was about good science. It was about good economics. And we focused our arguments on that. And doing so as an organisation, we got a lot of traction very quickly. And look, you know, the Queensland Country Life had a massive part in ABC Rural, had a massive part in promoting us. They were, I think, Brad managed to have us articles in the Country Life. I think something in the vicinity in that first 12 months. I think it was 47 weeks straight. You know, so I was doing interviews every day, radio, TV, the printed press, and we're getting our message out to a broader community outside of our agricultural sector. That, you know, that what was happening. So yeah, it got very professional very quickly, and we had our first AGM in Roma and massive attendance. So yeah, it had become then about the broader issue of sort of the focus on the McKay case. That was our first fighting fund investment, and it was one that returned massive dividends, luckily. It also gave us a platform to obtain funding through the National Farmers, the NFF fighting fund, which was the first for Queensland. They with massive fighting fund, but Queensland producers had never accessed it, and it was almost impossible to access. But we got funding off the back of PRA, and once again, based on science and good economics, we were able to convince the NFF to also back the McKay case. So we started to, and the focus was very much about that type of approach: is hold the government accountable based on science, based on facts, based on good economics, whilst also then being relevant in the debate, both with the public and in particular the federal and state government. So yeah, that's where it started, Eric.
What were your highlights as the inaugural chair?
I think probably the fact that we did it differently. So being an organisation that was singly focused, as I said, not relying on any government subsidies, government funding, and not having to negotiate on broader issues like export markets or whatever it might be. So that true independence, I think, was, and the fact that fundamentally the organisation was about facts. It was about not just standing up and saying, because this affects us, it's wrong. So, you know, it was, no, the government's decision here has not been based on good science or good economics. So being really factually based. Look, ultimately, I think it was on the legal front where we achieved probably some of our greatest outcomes. So winning the McKay case and the subsequent appeals, I don't think people understand, and they'll never understand, what a benefit that gave landowners right throughout Queensland. Because what it did, it put to the end of this belligerent, draconian prosecution of the state of landowners for really what were arbitrary breaches of permits based on retrospective use of new technology. And look, I won't look, you know, we were right in the heart of that on a professional basis, but we only ever saw the cases that got actually ultimately prosecuted, and none of those were successful ultimately. What we never saw, and look, I've got to say, I would have had phone calls from hundreds of landowners that had the so-called tree police turn up at the front gate. And PRA had a very simple message: I'd love to help you, but not right now. Put your questions in writing, I'll get back to you. And honestly, that's all it took, because the government only had a certain amount of time to prosecute, and we taught our membership to basically instill their civil right and hold the government accountable, make the government work every inch of the way. And like I said, there wouldn't have been 5% of those type investigations ever proceed to prosecution. And of the prosecutions, there was none that was ultimately successful. that we were involved with. And I think that came back to, because generally, like I said, we're a compliant group. So people actually hadn't intentionally broken the law in the vast majority. Look, there were some cases, we're all aware of some cases where landowners chose to do what they wanted to do. And that's something the PRA never endorsed, never stood behind. But so yeah, the McKay case was a real big one because it did provide this level of protection that it stopped the retrospectivity. So if you cleared your land under those old style permits, you could go to bed at night not being concerned that you're going to have to face a $500,000 trial and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. Strategically, I think the inroads we made with the federal government, and John Ennis in particular, was a real highlight. Getting recognition, and I think that recognition has benefited the industry to some extent moving forward. That a better understanding. Look, I haven't spoke much about the state opposition. Look, Lawrence Springborg was leader of opposition at the time during my entire tenure. Unbelievable. We had Lawrence and his team gave us much support to PRA as they could. And I mean, that support went from getting us access to government, getting us access to the resources of Parliament. So we spent a lot of time when legislation was drafted to actually enact these laws, the ban clearing. We did a lot of work, and Graham Kenny was one of the silent achievers there. He was my business partner, and Graham did two things. A, Graham kept my business alive while I was off doing this, but B, he was really instrumental in some of the really smart things that happened. So around the legislation piece. And so we worked during that, at the back of PRA, we were invited to advise the opposition, the coalition at the time, during the debate on legislation. So Graham and I sat in Parliament House for 3 days on the phones, non-stop to the floor as legislation was being debated. And Lawrence taught us the parliamentary process that during question time, the more we could get on Hansard, the bigger weapon we had to defend ourselves in the future as an industry. And we got some really significant interpretation down on the public record, on the Hansard record, and to the fact that over time, the government actually moved to plug those holes that they actually created for themselves. So we made them articulate over those 3 days exactly what they meant by the law. And what that did, that gave us a framework to hold them accountable for, because they're bureaucrats. They didn't actually, the law was a bit irrelevant to them, to be honest. They just did what they thought they were going to do. So behind the scenes, we achieved a hell of a lot with the interpretation of those amendments. And look, don't get me wrong, within 3 or 4 years, most of those opportunities that we created there, the government moved to close through amendments. But ultimately, all that was overturned by subsequent governments anyway. The other thing we did through PRA was being that, and this once again was our relationship with the federal government, that we were invited to say that we created enough noise around the issue that the federal government got the Federal Productivity Commission to do actually a review nationally, but with a big focus on Queensland, on what was the economic effect of environmental law changes, in particular the tree clearing ban in Queensland. So the Federal Productivity Commission, and that you're talking, that's an investment by the feds in the millions and millions to do that. So they took submissions. PRA funded a submission, which Graham and myself led. We got in and we grabbed every scientist we could who basically worked for tea and biscuits, and I'm forever grateful for guys like Dr. Ian Beale and we had a lot of scientists from within government. Dr. Burrows, unbelievable assistance to us that fed information into us. We employed economists from the universities to do a submission to the Productivity Commission. I think they received something in the vicinity of in excess of 200 submissions. Well, the PRA submission was picked out. It was one of 3 that the Productivity Commission then went and engaged further work by those people, by us, to actually to do work on, and that which they base their findings on. Like, well, it might be 3 or 4, and that's published now. So that's published in the Productivity Commission findings, and PRA did that. And what that proved was what the government was saying was outright lies, that there was no economic cost, and the Productivity Commission come out and once again put on the public record, no, this has a monetary cost associated with it. So that was a really major achievement for the organisation. To actually get the NFF to start supporting causes in Queensland, so the actual fighting fund, access to the fighting fund, the NFF, PRA were able to start to use that. Another one. Look, I think, but most of all, it was the people. Highlight for me was the people. So the board, the board in my time, Michael Flynn, Noel Mobbs, Des Cuff, working with Brad Henderson, a really talented gentleman who, John Purcell come on the board, and then eventually, part of our succession plan, a really good succession in place. John replaced me. I stayed on as John's deputy for a year. But our members, because we had a very passionate group of people that did what they could. So yeah, they were the highlights, Eric.
How do you remember Ashley McKay, and what is his legacy?
Yeah, there's a bit of sadness in this one, to be honest. How do I remember Ash? Look, at the industry level, he was an industry stalwart, as we know, and a leader. He was meticulous in his research, passionate, belligerent. He'd never give up. But most of all, Ashley was brave. And Ashley stood up, and why Ashley was charged and why Ashley ended up was because Ashley was, without doubt in my mind, singled out by the Beattie government because he was brave, because he was belligerent, because he had stood up above his peers for the 20 years leading up to that, and the 20 years, something years later, until his untimely death. And on a personal level, Ash was one of my great mentors, a loyal friend beyond words. Yeah, he's a great man.
Thank you for kicking off what is a very necessary industry group in this state. And it seems that you had the right people at the right time to kick off some much needed conversations. Hopefully there's another 20, 30, 40 more years in the joint. So Dominic, thank you for your time today, mate.
No, thanks, Eric. And I just, like I said, I congratulate the current board. I know how hard it is to do what you do. I congratulate the boards that have come before you and the people that have, and congratulate your members that continue to stand behind the organisation, to stand up and say the things that sometimes aren't easy to say. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Eric. I really appreciate it.